Now we are going to have another terrific speaker who's a recognized presenter in national circle, in fact. Vance Taylor is the chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs at the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Vance is responsible for ensuring the needs of individuals with disabilities and person with access or functional needs are identified before, during, and after disasters and integrated into state emergency management system. Born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area, Vance was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy as a child and uses a powerful wheelchair. He has worked in Washington, D.C. as an advisor for 2 different members of Congress, directed security policy at a national water association, been a principal at a ranked Homeland Security and emergency management consulting firm. Vance is a nationally recognized public speaker, as I mentioned, and advocate for individuals with disabilities. Vance has a master's degree in Homeland Security from the University of Connecticut and an undergrad degree from Brigham Young University in Communications. He is married to his sweetheart, Casey, and they have 2 wonderful daughters. Vance and his family live in Rancho Cordova, California. And without further ado, I give you Vance Taylor. Chief Taylor, the floor is yours. And welcome to SDAC.
Hey, thanks, Bobby. Appreciate it. It's good to be here and always very supportive of the great work that SDAC is participating in, and of course, leading for people with disabilities. So thank you to everybody that's on the line. Also, thanks to everybody online, because I know a lot of times, we're dealing with the internet. There's a lot of content, so we're competing with Netflix right now, and appreciate you watching this instead of checking out some other show. So Bobby had asked me to come on and talk a bit about what I do and the role that I have as chief of the Office of Access and Functional Needs. And so I wanted to talk about that and really start out by saying that the reason why the Office of Access and Functional Needs exists is because historically, what we've seen is that considerations for people who have physical, developmental, or intellectual disabilities, as well as other access and functional related needs, haven't been integrated within the way we plan, prepare, respond, and recover from disasters. So nationally, this really came to a head during Hurricane Katrina. We saw a very disproportionate impact on people with access and functional needs. In fact, during Hurricane Katrina, we watched, most of us on our televisions, as 70% of everyone who died had an access or functional needs. And what came out of that was some really difficult questions, right? Why was the impact so disproportional? And part of what came back is that these plans and systems that were developed to help keep people safe and secure and healthy, to ensure that people could maintain independence, were developed by very well-intentioned individuals, but people who didn't have a lived experience with an access or a functional need. And because they didn't have that experience, they basically didn't know what they didn't know. So those plans and those systems were created in a way that they had gaps, fundamental gaps built into them. And those gaps really came to a head and were seen and felt, particularly by the community, when the actual disaster occurred. So by way of perspective, the example that I like to give is the fact that I use a power wheelchair. I have for most of my life. And so whenever I go places, I'm thinking about access, right? Is there going to be a ramp? Will there be an elevator? Are there curb cuts? Will the placard parking spaces be available? I think about this everywhere I go. But chances are, if you can walk and run and jump, you don't think about those same access issues at all. You don't worry about, if I get invited to a friend's house for dinner, are there steps at the front of their house? You don't get nervous when the sign says elevator is not working today. And it's not that one perspective is good and the other perspective is bad. It's just that based on our lived experience, we can view the same thing and see it very differently. And it's important that when we're coming up with plans, especially plans that impact entire communities, that we have as many different perspectives at the table as possible. So that wasn't happening in emergency management. In fact, most emergency managers you had coming from former law enforcement, former military, former first responder types, individuals that I often refer to as the salt of the earth. I mean, these are people that run towards danger, right? They want to help. But again, they weren't planning with the benefit of having a broader view. And so they would say things like, hey, let's have a press conference. That's how we'll get emergency information out to people. And that sounds great at the surface. But because they weren't thinking about communication access, nobody considered the fact that this emergency life-saving information you're putting out is going to literally fall on deaf ears. And so there was no ASL interpreter. They didn't stop to consider the fact that when you point to the evacuation map and say, go here for safety, that if someone is blind or has low vision, they can't process that information. They didn't really stop to consider the fact that if you only put the message out in English, that anyone that doesn't understand English isn't going to be able to take advantage of that info either. And so you had individual populations of people who were already somewhat marginalized in society that were being completely left in the dark when it came to knowing what's coming, how do I prepare, what are the appropriate things I need to do to respond, and how do I maintain my safety? So is it any wonder that they got hit the hardest? On things like evacuation, you had well-intentioned plans that said things like, we're going to load people up on school buses. And that's how we'll get them out of the area. And that sounds great until you show up in a wheelchair and you're asking, where's the lift? Where's the ramp? Where's the accessible vehicle? And there is none. And so now you have to make that choice of, do I get picked up and put onto the school bus? Having to leave my wheelchair behind, which means wherever it is we're going, when we get there, I'm not going to have my legs. Or do you choose to stay in the impact area so you can remain in your wheelchair and then just hope and pray that you're going to be okay. It's a terrible position to put people in. There were shelters that were being established on the second floor of buildings with no elevators. There were shelters that, while they were physically accessible, they weren't programmatically accessible. And what I mean by that is, if somebody, for example, with a disability showed up and they didn't have their support network with them, there was nobody at the shelter to assist them with feeding, with toileting, with transferring them in and out of a cot. And so many people with disabilities went to shelters and they languished. And so at every step along the way, there were barriers that prevented everyone in the community from benefiting from the life-saving services that were supposed to be available for everyone. California recognized this. And California also understood that it's not just during large-scale national disasters that we see these type of issues. It's during all events, regardless of whether it's a fire, a flood, or an earthquake, regardless if it covers a large or small geographic area. Anytime there's a disaster, the one consistent factor is that people with access and functional needs will be disproportionately impacted. And so, to try and get ahead of this issue, the governor created the Office of Access and Functional Needs and appointed a senior level executive to serve as chief, to report directly to the director and the governor on these issues. Now, as chief, I'm responsible for essentially implementing a twofold mission. The first part is to identify what are the needs that all Californians have before, during, or after a disaster. And then the second part of that is to work with the community and with emergency managers to integrate those needs throughout every facet of the emergency management system. And so what we want is a more prepared, safer, more resilient California. And that means everybody. It's interesting because for so long, you've had people planning for individuals with disabilities, not with people with disabilities. And it kind of reminds me of a story, and I use this sometimes as the example but I've got two kids. And I remember when my girls were young, I think one was in second grade, the other might have been in kindergarten. The circus came to town. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to be super dad. And I'm going to go and we're going to take these kids out of school and surprise them by taking them to the circus. And they will forever cheer my name as Father of the Year because it was this great surprise. So we end up, my wife and I, we picked them up. The girls get in the van, and the plan was that we weren't going to tell them where we were going. Right? We'd just wait till we got to the main event. But you know how kids are. Where are we going? How long till we get there? Are we there yet? Where are we going? How long till we get there? Are we there? They keep going and going and going. So finally, they wore us down. And I said, girls, we're taking you to the circus. And boom, instant tears. And it was not what I was expecting. They were not tears of joy. These kids were upset. One of them says, but we were going to go to the library and I was going to pick out my favorite book. The other one says, we were playing a game after recess and it was going to be really fun. We wanted to stay at school. So they're crying and crying and crying. Do you have any idea how much cotton candy I had to buy in order to turn this day around? The thing is, we were planning for them, not with them. The same thing happens at the community level. We think we know what's best for people, and we don't consult those individuals. And then something happens, and we wonder, wow, how did that go wrong? The fact is that if we have a seat at the planning table, we need to look around and see who's not there. We need to be able to look around and identify, hey, who's not there. We have to be able to bring people to the table. So, Bobby, I see you nodding your head. I think you know what I'm talking about, right? So, you know, we've all been caught in this before. And again, well-intentioned people. So when we talk about working together in emergency management, what does that look like? So we work really close with great partners like the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, California Foundation for Independent Living Centers, Disability Rights California, DREDF, CalOES, Leading Age, the AAAs. You know, we've got these great, fantastic partners. And we work together in a variety of ways. One way, for example, is we had an active shooter situation in Southern California. We thought, because it occurred at a regional center, that it was an attack on people with disabilities. It turned out that wasn't quite the case, but it did raise the question, what if it had been? Right? So I'm looking through the guidance, which says run, hide, fight. So you lost me at run. And I'm looking at the videos that the Department of Homeland Security put out. And they've got people jumping over desks and turtling over chairs. Nowhere in that video do you see somebody with non-accessory function needs. And so at the same time that I was talking with our director about this gap, a news article came out and the State Council on Developmental Disabilities was quoted as saying that we need to step up in this area as a state. So I called our executive director and said, hey, we're thinking the same thing. Let's get together on this. We brought together stakeholders from across the disability spectrum. We joined up with law enforcement, with California Specialized Training Institute, and with other emergency management representatives. And what came out of that process was a development of the nation's first integrated active shooter awareness guidance. And I have to tell you that it wasn't an easy process. On the front end, it took some time. It was a challenge because following this long history of marginalization, there's a disconnect between the community and emergency management. And so it took time to build trust and to earn credibility. But let me tell you what, it's been my experience that it's difficult not to like people up close, right? Because what happens is you start to realize, hey, we're both well-intentioned. Hey, we all have the same goal. And hey, maybe we're a lot more alike than we thought we were. And you start to recognize each other's strengths. What do you bring to the table? What do I bring to the table? And hopefully sometime between lunch and the afternoon, you start to develop some personal feelings of liking one another as well. So what started out as a group where maybe our first 1 or 2 meetings were a little bit tenuous, ended up being a very close-knit group. Not only did we develop this guidance, which we've been very happy to see other states adopt, it was also picked up as part of the federal training program, and law enforcement throughout the state are trained on it. But these same stakeholders have come together to plan, prepare, and respond to other emergencies as well. And that's part of the benefit, right? Is if you plan for one emergency, then the same stakeholders can come together to plan for a different one. So, for example, when it comes to something like public safety power shutoffs, right? This program that the investor-owned utilities run, where they de-energize power lines, they do it in their thinking to reduce the risk of wildfire. Right? If it's hot, there's low humidity and there's high wind, there's a concern that something's going to hit the power line, it'll spark, and that's going to cause a big wildfire. Their thinking was, if we just de-energize that line, if something hits it, there'll be no spark and therefore no fire. Well, that makes sense, except for people with disabilities. Essentially, you're shifting risk from I'm going to die in a wildfire to I'm going to die because I don't have power. Right? If I've got a ventilator, if I'm on oxygen, if I use assistive devices and technologies, I rely on power. So to address this issue, one of the steps that we've taken is to bring these stakeholders back to the table and develop the California Foundation of Independent Living Centers, the DDAR program. Now, that's a program which is funded through PG&E, which provides things like free hotel vouchers. It provides things like backup batteries. It helps cover the cost of spoiled foods. It provides gas cards and free accessible transportation to help individuals that rely on power before, during, and after a PSPS event. And that Disability Disaster and Access and Resources Program is not just being used now when lines get de-energized. We've activated it during extreme heat. We've also activated it throughout the winter storms. So again, by working together, developing integrated plans, and having this relationship between the community and emergency management, safer, better programs are coming that help with a variety of disasters. So that's a part of the work that we lead, and that we get to be involved in. And it's been pretty fantastic to see that not only are programs getting better, but that throughout the state, as we've worked with each county to marry up emergency managers with their community stakeholders, that we've seen a cultural shift when it comes to this issue of access and functional needs. That instead of being something that maybe didn't even come to mind, it's now on the front end of people's minds. It's now something that people are deeply committed to. It's something that people recognize, I think, as the most personal thing we do, the most human thing we do. It doesn't take people long to think about somebody that they know, whether it's themselves or a member of the family or a friend, somebody who's got an access or functional need that they know and love and care about. And you ask that question, what wouldn't you do to make sure that that person made it through a disaster safely? And then we adopt that approach and apply it to all of our planning. And along with our partners, work to get that integrated throughout every facet of the emergency management process. I'll close out here, Bobby, but I'll maybe share just one quick story. I told her I've got 2 daughters. One of my daughters runs cross country and she's pretty quick. The other one runs cross country and it's kind of a struggle for her, but this kid is just determined. And so every meet, she's there and her goal is to finish. Well, coach told her, hey, you're going to do a 5K. She was pretty nervous. And for a long time, she kept asking before the race, I don't even think I can do this. And finally, what we decided was that for her, finishing was the win, right? Didn't matter what place she finished in, just finishing was the win. Normally, her mother and I would like to be there, but my wife and I weren't able to be there that day. And so what we relied on was our youngest daughter to call and give us the update. So we start listening, and our daughter's like, I'm at the finish line. I don't see her. I don't know if she's coming. And we waited and we waited. And finally, we hear, there she is. And as she came in, all of her teammates and the crowd cheered her on. And she finished, right, which was a huge win for us. Well, that night, we were asking her about her experience. And she said, it was interesting because I got to a point where I was going to quit. I just didn't have the strength to go on. And all of a sudden, there were these 2 women on the sidelines. I'd never seen them before. I don't know who they are. But they started cheering for me loud. They started yelling things like, run, baby girl, run. The other one was saying, you're stronger than you know. Then they yelled, you're a champion, you're a champion. And their cheering somehow gave me the strength I needed to go on. And with that in my mind, that you're stronger than you know, you're a champion, I pushed myself to finish. And I share that with you because it's a reminder. It's not enough for us to want integration to occur. it's not enough for us to hope inclusion is going to happen. We must be actively engaged in not just pushing ourselves, but in cheering on others to meet this mission. So many people want to do the right thing, but they either don't feel empowered or they don't feel like they can. Our role is to push them on, to remind them they have more strength than they know, to remind them that they're champions, and to cross that finish line together. It's a lift. This mission is a lift. But I'll tell you that if you lift, I know Bobby's going to lift, and I'll lift. And together, the communities that we all serve will ascend. So thank you for letting me share about this program. Thank you for the work that you do. I appreciate the partnership. Bobby, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. And you have a few minutes for Q&A, Vance?
Yeah.
Excellent. Very inspirational stories. I love the stories about how you identified and talked about your daughters. Thought one was going to go to the library and the other one was going to do something else. Instead, circus was not their priority. And that's a good lessons for all of us to learn from, that stakeholders need to be involved in decision-making process. And only then they can share, and you can get the benefit of their desire and needs. Anyway, so that's my comment about that. The question I have, and Chad, do you have any advice for us about advocating for taking care of access needs in emergencies locally, like evacuation at the office? Are there statutes that we can use to advocate for enhancing our office's emergency plan, such as state of California staff? And of course, majority of the folks here are state of California staff. So do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that come to mind. The first is, you got to know what the plan is, right? How many of us actually know what the emergency evacuation plan is for our building? So that's, I think, step one is let's get to know the plan. And as we look at that plan, let's make sure that we're giving an opportunity for all employees with different lived experiences to comment on that plan, right? So we've got a plan here at CalOES. I was actually at a different meeting, but somebody shared the story with me. The question was, hey, we're upstairs. If there's something going on, we had to evacuate. And Vance was upstairs. How do we get him downstairs? One of my colleagues, a very strong individual, said, no sweat. I'd pull Vance out of his chair, throw him over my shoulder, and run him out of the building. Look, I appreciate the intent, right? I love that they thought about me. That would kill me, probably, but I love that their heart was in the right place. And so that's part of why we have to make sure that people with all experiences are looking at these plans, because it's helpful to say, hey, your heart's in the right place, but let me tell you the best way to help evacuate me. So that's the first thing is, let's take a look at the plan. Second thing is, let's make sure everyone can comment on those plans. And then third, of course, let's do some exercises and some training. We have so much turnover. And it's really helpful when new people come in to train them up in whatever the best practices that we're going to use. When we used to do press conferences, it was sort of this Herculean effort to try and get an ASL interpreter, right? Do we need one? Should we get one? How do we get one? Well, now that's just part of the standard operating procedure. I was talking to one of our newest members on the comms team, and I asked, what do you need for a press conference? She said, do you need a camera, a microphone, and an interpreter? She has no idea that that was not always the case. To her, that's just the way it is. And that shows progress and an evolution in the way that we do our work. It's the same way on the evacuation planning. Your new employees should just take these best practices for what they are, and that's going to help the culture of the agency.
Great. Thank you so much for that response. One of the questions that came up in the chat is, where is the link to that federal training? And I personally want to know what happened to run, hide, fight, deviation to accommodate person with disabilities in this kind of environment, active shooter or whatever else disaster that you have. What was the outcome of that meeting? You mentioned California Specialized Training Institute was involved and a bunch of the stakeholders were involved.
Yeah, it's great. And actually, you can find it on our website, which I'd encourage everybody to go to. We've got a great website. If you go to CalOES, there's a page for the Office of Accessible Functional Needs. And within there, we've got what we call an AFN library. And it's essentially a clearinghouse of the best AFN preparedness information, whether it's best practices, lessons learned. We've got some videos, a lot of guides, checklists. That's in there. So I'd go there. Bobby, to answer your question, one of the things that we looked at when we say run, what we really mean is evacuate, right? So what are ways that we can evacuate quickly? Whether that's, we need to have a buddy system in place, whether that's what we as individuals do in order to make sure that we can map out what our own route is going to be, right? We also break that guide into 3 different parts. One is for employers, right? As an employer, you have a role and a responsibility for helping ensure the safety of your workers. What does that mean when you're dealing with individuals with disabilities? Number 2 is for the individual themselves, right? I have a responsibility for my own health and safety. So what am I thinking about in terms of evacuation or hiding or fighting if it comes down to it? What can I do? And then the 3rd is for law enforcement. But while we're not going to dictate tactics, what we are going to do is ensure that they've got enough situational awareness and training so that when they enter onto a site and they yell, "Everyone put your hands up," they'll know that if I don't do it, it's not because I'm part of the threat, right? It's because I can't physically comply. And that is great because then we start to ensure that they don't perceive people as threats who aren't threats. So definitely encourage everybody to take a look at that.
Excellent idea. One of the other comments that came in the chat had to do with PG&E and the program that you described during the the PSP power outage. People that are reliant on electricity will need some help. And typically, this person writes that medical baseline allowance is a rate schedule that relates to person who are dependent on electricity. Those are the folks that typically gets notified of the PSPs and so on and so forth. If you're not on the medical baseline, then you would not be notified. And she's wondering, is there a way that there could be a voluntary list of person who are not on medical baseline and get notified? Are you aware of anything like that, Vance?
Yeah, I love that that point got brought up because we tackled that exact issue. So now, yes, you can go to whoever your IOU is, right? Whether that's PG&E or SCE or SDG&E. And you can actually sign up for these PSPS related alerts and notifications. And then you can sign up for all those alerts, even if you're not a medical baseline customer. And so that's something that we wanted to make sure is that the IOUs were doing more to provide not just information about this program or what it is and that it exists, but that during actual events that they were alerting and alerting and alerting. Right, we just don't feel like you can over alert in that situation.
Yeah.
So yeah, great question, and yeah, we tackled it, and that's an option for folks now.
Great. Thank you. Glad to hear that there is such an option that they can voluntarily sign up for that. The other matter related to this PG&E PSP, and we are talking about that because that happens in our area quite a bit because of the high fire risk and so forth. PG&E is trying to mitigate the risk by shutting off power, just like you described. But then there is a segment of the population and the customers have to deal with, what do? We need to, we're reliant on electricity because of, breathing machines, power, wheelchairs, so on and so forth. You mentioned that their program, they offer batteries, backups, and so forth. How do one go about asking for those assistance? And secondarily, are they adequate to cover for the duration of the outage? And are there any long-term solution to that, such as having solar backup or solar battery backup or something like that, which are very costly and, expensive for most?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. First off, I did put the link for the DDAR program in the box there.
Thank you.
So, look, the long and short is that while this is a good program that provides good resources, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. Right. And so one of the things that we really want is to see the IOUs grow and expand this program. Right. I think the idea initially was, hey, let's do a pilot and see about proof of concept. And what we're finding is that, yeah, it works. That people want to take advantage of it, can. What we're finding though is that there are more people that have a need than there are resources to provide the assets to meet those needs. And so to your point, let's look at how does that get expanded to include all options, including things like solar walls and other neat backup provisions that will get people through the duration of an event. And that's an ongoing struggle.
Yep. All right. Anyway, do we have any questions for Chief Vance here? He's been very generous with his time and provided really a wealth of information that our community specifically can use on a day-to-day basis. And if you do have a question, either raise your hand or unmute and ask.
And Bobby, I probably have time for about one more. And if there's anything after that,
okay.
If you just want to email me, I'm happy to respond.
Great. I will do that. Hearing no other questions, I'm going to spare you the agony of having to wait for another question. And I thank you so much. We appreciate your attendance. It's always such a pleasure to have you here, Chief Vance, and come back and see us soon anytime you have time. And, this has been a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby. Appreciate it.